In this lecture, we will survey the historical and literary context for Ambrose Bierce's An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Ambrose Bierce was the 10th of 13 children, all given names that began with an A. His parents were poor farmers in southeastern Ohio who then relocated to Indiana. They were chasing the dream of Western expansion, but found no greater success in a new state. One of the more interesting facts about Bierce is that we're not sure how he died. After a career in the Civil War and establishing himself as a journalist in California, he decided to travel to Mexico at the ripe age of 72. He wanted to meet the revolutionary Pancho Villa and comprehend firsthand the Civil War taking place there. His last letter out of the country was dated December 26, 1913, and beyond that, he was never heard from again. We don't know where and when he died. The contemporary Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes insisted after this date that one could still hear stories about an old gringo wandering the Mexican countryside. Bierce's writings are known, among other things, for their bitterness and focus on themes of war. When he was 18, Bierce enlisted in the 9th Indiana Infantry, that is the Union Army, and fought throughout the war in numerous military engagements. From 1863 to 1864, he worked as a topographical officer, that is a scout, who surveyed beyond enemy lines, probing for potential threats and mapping marches, not unlike the Federal scout dressed as a Confederate soldier in Bierce's short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Scouting was largely a one-man job, and for the most part, Bierce liked the nature of his work, the way it was detail-oriented, methodical, and meaningful, potentially saving many lives by avoiding unnecessary conflict. However, the job was also highly dangerous. As a lone man, Bierce surveyed some of the most famous and bloodiest battlegrounds of the Civil War, including the battles of Shiloh and Chickamauga. On June 23, 1864, he himself received a bullet wound to the head, which, as he said, crushed his skull like a broken walnut. He was temporarily sent home on a hospital train to recover and suffered fever and delirium from his wound. Many critics actually find parallels between his descriptions of his near-death experience and slow journey on the train with his descriptions in our story of Farquhar's journey towards death and his death deliriums. After Bierce recovered, he returned to active duty only to be captured by the Confederate Army. While waiting for orders to battle, he and a comrade, named Cobb, decided to while away the time by traipsing about the countryside and splashing about in some creeks. The Union and Confederate armies at the time were located about 30 miles apart, and so he and Cobb were just wandering about when they happened upon an overgrown plantation where a handful of Southern women and children were playing in a yard, and suddenly some rebel cavalry opened fire upon them. His friend Cobb dove into the woods, while Bierce clambered across a fence and dashed into a nearby swamp. Behind him, he could hear the calls to bring the dogs and hunt him down. Come nightfall, he tried to pick his way through towering cornfields and muddy streams back to his campsite, and along the way he stumbled upon 2 enemy campsites. At the first, he was fortunate. They were asleep. At the second, he was less fortunate. A guard took a shot at him, and Bierce had to scamper up a tree to hide until dawn. He eventually tried building a raft to cross the river back to the Union side, but just as he was about to take off from shore, he heard the click of a gun behind his head, and he was captured. Fatigued and with feet so swollen he could no longer wear his boots, he was a sight to see for the Confederates who had heard rumors of Union scout bumbling about in their area. They treated him decently, put him to bed, and eventually he was able to escape by running out in the middle of the night while guards dozed, and by the time he stumbled back into camp, he found that his friend, Cobb, had already resourcefully returned. While Bierce described himself as a zealous soldier, he did not like war. The war left America exhausted. 3 million men fought in the Civil War. In a nation of about 31 million, that's about 1/10 of the American population in 1860. Of those 3 million, at least 620,000 soldiers from the North and South died in total, and approximately 400,000 more were wounded. In other words, if you fought in the war, your odds of dying in the Civil War were at least 1 in 5. Your odds of only being wounded but surviving were somewhere between 1 in 7 or 1 in 8. And if we were to throw these two numbers together, your odds as a soldier in the Civil War of being either wounded or dying of disease, as a prisoner of war, or in battle were about 1 in 3. These are very high odds, higher than any other individual war in American history. In fact, the number of casualties from the Civil War were so great that they outnumber the total number of American casualties from the American Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and Korean War combined. That is, more Americans died in the Civil War than all major wars combined before the Vietnam War. It is only with the Vietnam War added on top of these other wars that the total number of American deaths is finally, and even then only barely, surpassed. And all this is an underestimation. Most records from both the Union and Confederate sides were geared towards determining troop strength, not on keeping track of exactly how many had died, and especially not on who died. Anywhere to a half of the men killed in battle were buried without proper identification, which makes it difficult for us today to know exactly how many lives were lost. In 2011, historian J. David Hacker reviewed new census data in order to challenge the old accepted statistic that 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War, and instead he argued that it's possible that as many as 850,000 died in the Civil War, meaning that up to 28%, rather than just, and I say that loosely, 20% of the soldiers may have died during the war. I mention all this to help us understand where Bierce's bitterness comes from. His nonconformist attitude is evident from his early years. While still in school, he worked on the Northern Indianan, an anti-slavery newspaper, and after the war, after he had traveled a bit, he settled in San Francisco and worked as a journalist, earning a nefarious reputation among the Californian Literary Society as, quote, Bitter Bierce, and, quote, the wickedest man in San Francisco, labels which he enjoyed. He wanted to write scathing criticisms of those he thought were unscrupulous, corrupt, or even just pompous, and he criticized the idealizations of war. The war was the brutal evidence of growing social, political, and economic divisions between the North and South. But it had also created a need for efficient and far-reaching infrastructures for communication and transportation, and by the 90s, technological and industrial innovations had galvanized rapid urban growth and commercial developments. The war helped establish the technological and industrial framework upon which America modernized. It is in this century, for instance, that electricity, the telephone, and the telegraph were introduced large scale across the nation, especially in urban areas, but running even into the small towns. In our short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, there is immense focus on the railroad bridge. One reason for this is because it is the train and railroad that best symbolizes, caused, and resulted from the postbellum boom in material wealth. The first transcontinental railroad in America was completed in 1869, and by the 1890s, a network of railroads wove across the countryside, joining all states and their regional markets in agriculture and manufactured goods. That includes fruits and vegetables from California, cattle from Texas, corn from Iowa, lumber from Minnesota, cotton from Georgia and Alabama, coal from West Virginia, and iron from Pennsylvania. By 1890, the United States had nearly half of the world's railroad mileage. The railroad symbolizes progress, but it also symbolizes corruption. The federal government, eager to support industrial expansion, condoned the cutthroat nature of growing monopolies such as Rockefeller's Standard Oil, Carnegie's United States Steel, and the Southern Pacific Railroad. By 1890, this rapid expansion of industrialization led to significant wage growth for many in the labor force. Middle class affluence was on the rise, but most notably, the 1% with which we are so familiar today materialized in a real way, coming to own over 25% of the nation's wealth and widening the wealth gap. This period, 1877 to 1900, during which the short story was published, is known as the Gilded Age, a label that suggests how, under the veneer of wealth and success, America suffers. During the war, bridge burning of these burgeoning railroads was common, becoming almost epidemic in eastern Tennessee, where civilians were sympathetic to the Union side. Civilian bridge burners were typically tried in military courts and, as we saw in the story, hung with dispatch. Occasionally, on the remains of the very bridges they were guilty of destroying. We see this happen with Farquhar, who is hung from the very bridge he tried to destroy. It's interesting to note that bridge burning was originally employed more by Union supporters when the story shows a Confederate supporter attempting to sabotage the bridge. But by 1862, strategic bridge burning by Confederate troops was being used against the pursuing Union Army as well. Bierce was in northern Alabama himself, where this story takes place, in the summer of 1862 to repair the railroad line, and critical sections of this railroad were later destroyed by the Confederates in late September 1864 to prevent the Union Army from using it. The story, Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, is considered a realist story. Realism, in many ways, is the effect of a rapidly changing nation. By 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner famously declared that the frontier no longer existed. The dream of westward expansion, which defined early America, had been achieved. Yet, as mentioned earlier, not everyone was reaping the benefits. By 1877, the plan for Reconstruction after the Civil War had failed, leaving black people of the South economically and politically vulnerable and disadvantaged. Likewise, millions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Italy, and the Balkan nations poured into the nation, resulting in an antebellum America of 31 million, exploding into a diverse America of 63 million by 1890, helping to double the American population in just a few decades. Many of these new populations turned to the cities for work. At the same time, rural Americans made their way into the cities as well. This population boom and shift fed into the problem of unchecked labor exploitation and corporate corruption, leaving many in poverty. And observing these changes in economy, politics, and society were journalists, novelists, and short story writers. Like other industries, the literary market evolved after the Civil War. More people were beginning to be able to read, supported by the development of free public grade in high schools, which led to an increase in rates of literacy. New technology like steam-powered presses made for faster and cheaper printing, making it possible not just to distribute more literature, but for more people to afford the literature. And railroads, once again, opened possibilities for a national market. Even the industrial sector participated, supporting the expansion of periodicals, wherein most literature was published at the time, by purchasing advertisement space. Now, realism is a broad term that comes in different shades and variations, and we'll continue to explore it in the following weeks. However, at the simplest level, realism is an aesthetic developed during the postbellum decades which strove to give a faithful representation of reality. The reason why the term realism can be problematic is because different people have different conceptions of what faithful representation means. So it's important to keep in mind that realism does not automatically imply accuracy, facts, or objective realities. Instead, realism can entail subjective and impressionistic perceptions of life. Even so, there are some typical commonalities that we can rely on for identifying realist literature. Most works of realism will not depend upon magic or fantasy, and most will not idealize their subject matter either. Both of these, that is, the use of fantasy and idealization, are marks of an earlier aesthetic called Romanticism. Instead of fantasy and idealization, realism often focuses on making visible and critiquing current social, political, and economic inequities and injustices, including, for instance, racial inequality, women's rights, exploitation of laborers, exploitation of the land, and so forth. That's why realist works often, but not always, focus on lower and working class characters, as opposed to previous literature, which typically focused on upper class characters. Note too that I said that realism typically focuses on current issues. This is opposed to focusing on a distant past or stories based in a distant land. These are, once again, potential markers of fantasy and romanticism. In fact, rather than focus on distant times and places, realism tends to focus myopically on its subjects, setting the story in a specific time and place, and from there, extensively detailing the environment, people, and/or cultures with a close and keen eye, giving the effect that the narrator or author has truly observed the subject rather than imagined it. The action is usually plausible and often quotidian, or of the commonplace and everyday, and altogether the people, plot, and issues are often representative of ordinary rather than extraordinary life. Finally, the style is typically accessible for a broad audience, which means that the vocabulary and cultural references used are typically familiar to the audience. Readers do not need an elite or upper class education to understand it. These are some general guidelines to get us started on realism, and we'll adjust these as we proceed in the upcoming weeks. For now, however, we will use these guidelines to identify the realist elements in Bierce, and we'll do this in our discussion forum.